The American military no longer owns the nervous system of its own operations. They are quietly renting it from a venture capitalist, and the lease is strictly conditional.
You look at Trae Stevens and Anduril Industries, and a very specific cognitive trap springs shut. I mean, the public, the media, legacy defense contractors, they all see a standard Silicon Valley disruption narrative applied to the Pentagon.
They assume they are watching a startup trying to build better hardware, faster autonomous drones, cheaper surveillance towers.
Viewing Anduril as a hardware company is precisely wrong enough to be dangerous. You focus on the drones, you miss the hostile takeover of the procurement system itself.
If the Pentagon assumes it is buying a weapon, what happens when it realizes it only bought a password?
To see the takeover, you have to look at the battlefield they walked onto. The mainstream narrative presents this, well, highly sanitized version of the shift, framing Stevens and Anduril as the cure for a sluggish Department of Defense.
Historically, the Pentagon relies on a procurement structure called cost plus. You pay a traditional contractor, your Lockheed Martins, your Boeings, for the entire agonizing research and development process.
The government guarantees a profit margin on top of those costs, regardless of how long the engineering takes.
Or whether the final product even functions properly on the battlefield. I mean, imagine hiring a construction crew, signing a contract that guarantees them a 15% profit on whatever they spend, with zero penalty if they take 10 years to finish the roof.
The incentive structure mathematically demands delay. The F-35 fighter jet program is the monument to this logic, billions over budget, decades late.
The official map shows Stevens breaking that oligopoly by rejecting it entirely. He and Palmer Luckey start Anduril in 2017 with a radical premise.
They fund their own research and development through Founders Fund venture capital. They do not wait for government permission or massive federal grants.
They show up to military bases, not with slide decks begging for exploratory funding, but with finished, ready-to-use technology, hand-delivering bolt-M loitering munitions directly to the Marine Corps.
Standing up autonomous surveillance towers on the border. But the foundational assumption holding that narrative together is that Anduril is competing with legacy primes on the same terms.
The government looks at this and believes Anduril is simply a faster, cheaper metal bender fighting for the same disposable hardware contracts.
Selling physical hardware in a war zone is a fundamentally flawed business model. You send metal to a theater of combat, it gets destroyed.
A venture capitalist does not secure a $30.5 billion valuation and pull billion-dollar investments from Peter Thiel's funds by betting on disposable commodities.
Why risk your own capital to build a drone knowing its ultimate destiny is to be blown out of the sky by a $50 missile?
Stevens is not selling hardware. He is selling the operating system. The physical towers and the autonomous drones are nothing more than vectors for a deeper structural mechanism.
In 2019, he co-authored a report for the Defense Innovation Board titled Software is Never Done. That document became the institutional blueprint, pushing the Department of Defense to buy commercial, off-the-shelf software.
The actual architecture of Anduril reveals itself there. They sell systems where the government assumes the financial risk of the physical hardware breaking, while the company retains the intellectual property of the core software, Lattice.
Look at the mechanics of Lattice. It operates on a paradigm of open architecture with a closed core. The Pentagon maintains the illusion of choice.
They can buy sensors, radars, missile launchers from any of Anduril's legacy competitors, but to make those disparate pieces of hardware communicate in a unified network to allow a Lockheed radar to speak to a Boeing interceptor, they must all plug into Stevens's closed digital ecosystem.
They become peripheral devices.
Yeah.
Power isn't building the weapon, it's making the state dependent on your operating system to fire it.
The operational monopoly on the battlefield requires an equally impenetrable monopoly on the talent required to build it. Look at the public persona Stevens cultivates.
To an outside observer, it looked like a massive corporate liability. He openly calls himself an arms dealer. He quotes St. Augustine's just war theology to justify lethal, autonomous technology,
arguing that overwhelming technological lethality is the only path to deterrence. He actively partners with MAGA-aligned political networks and embraces the ideological baggage of Peter Thiel.
Silicon Valley conventional wisdom dictates that alienating a progressive engineering workforce is a fatal error. You saw this play out when Google engineers revolted over military AI in Project Maven.
The internal pressure forced the company to back down and abandon the defense contract entirely. The baseline assumption in the tech industry is that Stevens' theological rhetoric and aggressive political posturing is an ideological crusade that fundamentally limits his talent pool.
You cannot build the future of warfare if the smartest engineers coming out of MIT and Stanford refuse to work for you.
Why intentionally shrink the pool of the most highly sought-after talent in the world?
The alienation is the feature, not the bug. The theology and the embrace of highly controversial contracts operate as a calculated human resources mechanism.
Think about the AI-powered virtual border wall Anduril built for customs and border protection. They deployed this during a period of intense anti-immigrant political rhetoric.
Privacy groups like Magente and Privacy International launched massive, highly visible backlash campaigns. They accused the company of creating a dystopia of mass surveillance, aiming to make Anduril a pariah in the tech world.
Stevens refused to back down. He weaponized that public condemnation to construct an isolated ecosystem.
By making his company toxic to progressive activists, he created a bespoke pipeline of techno-nationalist engineers. He built a workforce completely immune to the moral panics of the broader tech industry.
These are employees who walk in the door already inoculated against the pressure campaigns that crippled Google. They will never protest a defense contract.
He turned moral revulsion into a competitive monopoly on compliant talent. His wife, Michelle Stevens, even launched a nonprofit called ACTS-17, which serves as a bridge between conservative theology and technological elites.
They are actively cementing an alternative cultural infrastructure. Monopoly isn't about crushing competitors. It's about building the environment where your competitors are forced to breathe.
The logical conclusion of controlling both the military software architecture and a private army of compliant engineers is direct political power.
By the end of 2024, with his net worth crossing $1 billion and close ties to the vice president, Stevens was perfectly positioned to assume a high-level government role.
The sources indicate he was considered for Deputy Secretary of Defense or Director of the NSA in the Trump administration. You assume the end game is to sit at the head of the table.
He turned those roles down. The fundamental assumption of American politics is that billionaires use their wealth to buy public office.
The contradiction you have to grapple with here is that the wealth legally prevents him from taking the seat. The federal ethics rules create a divestment trap.
Taking an official, confirmed role requires liquidating assets to avoid conflicts of interest. Stevens' billion-dollar net worth is not sitting in a checking account, it is entirely locked in a liquid startup stock.
He cannot simply sell his shares of Anduril on a public exchange tomorrow without catastrophic financial consequences. Leaving Founders Fund to take a government salary would trigger key man provisions.
For anyone operating outside the venture capital ecosystem, a key man clause is an agreement that allows institutional investors to immediately pull their money if a foundational partner leaves the firm.
His departure potentially collapses the entire capital structure of the fund itself. To avoid the oath of office and its resulting financial destruction, he governs de facto.
He relocates his influence to civilian advisory boards, entirely bypassing the confirmation process. He sits on the Atlantic Council's Commission on Software-Defined Warfare alongside former defense officials like Mark Esper.
Together, they write policy recommendations pushing the Pentagon to make commercial software the default standard. The Pentagon adopts those exact recommendations. Soon after, Anduril receives a $20 billion IDIQ indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity umbrella contract from the Army.
The stated goal of the contract is the consolidation of counter-drone systems under the unified management of the Lattice operating system. He directs a state's budget without ever submitting to its anti-corruption laws.
True influence requires staying just outside the blast radius of public accountability.
The IDIQ contract mechanism itself is the ultimate bureaucratic bypass. It acts as a pre-approved ordering guide, reducing procurement friction to zero.
Imagine giving every battlefield commander an Amazon Prime account funded by the taxpayer, where the only products available are built and managed by Anduril.
Any commander in the U.S. Army can now purchase these systems without navigating the agonizing delays of traditional competitive tenders. He engineered a scenario where the government's path of least resistance routes directly into his corporate treasury. The system is structurally sound, yet the source material contains two glaring anomalies that cannot be fully explained by this architecture. They remain load-bearing gaps in the narrative, and you have to look at what they signify.
First, the battlefield beta test. Industry reports indicate Anduril's Bolt-M drones and Lattice software are being actively utilized and tested by Ukrainian forces in live combat.
The company resolutely refuses to officially confirm this presence. We know the hardware is functioning in the theater of war. The anomaly is the mechanism of deployment.
How does Silicon Valley secretly navigate and test lethal AI in active geopolitical war zones, apparently without formal state authorization or diplomatic oversight?
The sources do not explain how a private venture capital firm executes foreign policy operations under the radar of the State Department. The pipeline from Palo Alto to the front lines of Kyiv remains completely opaque.
The second anomaly is the invisible counterattack. Stevens has forced Anduril into the Navy and Air Force's Collaborative Combat Aircraft Program, known as CCA.
They are competing to build autonomous drone wingmen, directly threatening the core aviation revenue of legacy primes like Lockheed Martin and Boeing.
The sources note rumors of a shadow lobbying war orchestrated by these legacy primes to sabotage Anduril in congressional budget committees. The traditional defense sector is fighting for its existence against an existential threat.
The exact mechanisms of how the old guard is executing this counteroffensive are hidden from public view. A systemic collision between the venture-backed insurgents and the century-old aerospace monopolies is inevitable, yet the battlefield for this proxy war remains undocumented.
You are watching two tectonic plates grind against each other beneath the surface, waiting for the earthquake.
This was never about a startup disrupting a slow Pentagon bureaucracy. It was about creating a new class of digital systemic administrators for the battlefield.
Stevens and his partners at General Catalyst and Red Cell launched Valinor Enterprises, an incubator designed specifically to act as a company of companies.
Valinor is quietly buying up every niche, neglected government software contract. They are executing a roll-up strategy, integrating those narrow, hyper-specific tools directly into Palantir Foundry and Anduril Lattice.
They are ensuring no data moves through the defense apparatus without touching their proprietary ecosystem. They're not competing for the defense budget, they are enclosing it.
The debate is no longer whether the government should rely on commercial technology for national security.
The question is, what happens when a sovereign state realizes it can no longer go to war without asking a venture capitalist for the password?
You have to ask yourself what happens when this exact same closed ecosystem logic is quietly applied to the software running our power grids, our financial markets, and our healthcare systems.